to it. So we've got an hour to talk about marijuana, which is a very complex topic, obviously. We'll cover a ton of ground in a relatively short period of time. I really want to do two things today. Talk about sort of the basics of it, again, because the reality is what you've heard over the last handful of years as people have talked about medical marijuana in Massachusetts and legalization of recreational marijuana and then the whole opting out and all this stuff. You've heard a lot of sort of half-truths. You know, you got people who have political skin in the game trying to get you to think one way or another about a topic that is much more complex than people try to make it out to be. So we'll focus on really where the evidence is first and foremost, and then in the second part we'll talk about what to do if you're concerned about somebody who is using cannabis or some other substance. You know, and again, this is generalizable, but we'll cover a lot of ground, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A too. So my contact information is up there. Feel free to think of me as a resource moving forward. In terms of disclosures, have been funded by NIDA. Recently had a grant from the World Health Organization. So as much as we're going to talk today about the problems associated with cannabis, I want to be fully transparent. I mean, there are medical indications for it, and I've been studying those too over the last several years. So my work with the WHO was to really summarize all of the available research for the therapeutic uses of cannabis. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition between somebody who, as you'll see, I mean, I treat patients who are addicted to cannabis on one hand, but on the other hand, we're interested in determining whether or not cannabis and various cannabinoids, which we'll explain, are helpful to treat certain medical conditions. So I think that sort of forms the foundation for why I take the sort of tack that I do. Again, most people who talk about this are strongly pro-cannabis or strongly anti-cannabis, and I'm kind of right in the middle, trying to be evidence-based in a topic where it's hard to be evidence-based because people are trying to get you to do one thing or another. The book I saw outside, so that's great, obviously. I would also say, as we get rolling here, we're really lucky in this area to have such a great coalition, a group like Scituate Facts. I mean, it really is rare. It's definitely one of the best in the state, I would say. And so it's been a pleasure to kind of come back year after year. I've been in the classrooms, done this event before last year, I think it was. So it really is something that you should be thankful for at this time of year, to have such a group. And it really is helpful in many ways, not the least of which to learn about these topics, but also to have somebody that you can go to. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces that I want you to take home today. It's not so much about what the facts are, and that's great to know that, what the science is on cannabis. But I think more importantly, this idea that should you decide, or should you become worried about somebody in your family or somebody that you know that might have a problem with a substance like cannabis or opioids or alcohol, you've got people that you can go to here. So that they access the best that Boston has to offer routinely, so you're in very good hands in that way. So what do I do? Let's talk a little bit about my background, because again, I think it forms the basis for how I approach cannabis. So when you think about cannabis, who do you hear about it from? The loudest voices in the debate are people who, again, are either strongly pro-cannabis or strongly anti-cannabis. And as a result of that, you think of who those people are. They may be lobbyists. They may be making money selling cannabis. They could be researchers who, again, are studying cannabis and the risks of cannabis. And I do some research, certainly, but my primary task is to treat patients every day. So I'm in there with my team. So I'm at Beth Israel. I have a team of social workers and nurses and myself, and we get in there with patients every day and get our hands dirty. So we're treating patients who have opioid use disorder. So as much as we're going to focus on cannabis today, it's a very exciting topic, certainly don't want to understate the importance of the opioid crisis. But that's a whole different thing. People are dying every single day. Our patients that we treat, some of them, every so often somebody dies. And so I think that's something that should be at least mentioned here today, as we've got other topics which are very important and relevant for youth. I think one thing to mention opioids again, we're fortunate that when you look at the data for young people, it's about 2% in most schools. I think Scituate is pretty similar. So about 2% of the high school population will have dabbled in opioids. And so that's a small fraction, but it's actually interesting that we're here today in a room of this size, because really when you think about it, you've got a typical 2,000 or a few thousand student school. It's a room like this that's full of people who have used opioids. So for that small group, maybe 2% of a larger population, there's 2% of that school, there's 30 people, there's 40 people that are using very deadly drugs. So there is a difference, as we'll talk about today, between cannabis and alcohol and opioids. And then finally, just to mention alcohol again, we'll talk a little bit more about it. And we're focused on youth today, but on my team, we see a lot of patients who have alcohol problems. And so as much as people are talking about the opioid crisis and people are talking about cannabis because of the votes and things like that, people don't tend to talk very much about alcohol, but it's as dangerous as ever. And we have people who are really fighting for their lives with alcohol, and they may need a liver transplant, or they're at risk of having other things happen. People may have falls, etc. So it's worth mentioning those things. When you do the work that I do, we see probably 40% alcohol, 40% opioids, and then 20% everything else. My private practice, again, opioids, alcohol, but kind of cannabis has kind of been my thing because of my research over the last several years. So I see a lot of young people, kind of the patients that we're going to talk about today. So that's one thing. Again, when you're hearing about opioids, or excuse me, when you hear about cannabis, who's talking about it? Have they ever treated anybody? They may be, it's important to have various roles in this whole conversation, but when you actually treat patients, I think it brings a little bit of a different perspective to it. So young people with cannabis problems, parents may have discovered cannabis use and they're worried about it, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. If you're a sports fan, obviously today's a bye week, but if you're a sports fan, you know that drugs and sport go hand in hand. So I work with all the local pro teams, really, the NFL, NBA, and the Red Sox, and so those patients, those players who have problems, I see them. I also help make the policy for a couple of those leagues too. So hopefully, if you're a fan of some of those leagues, you've noticed that they've become a little bit more progressive and evidence-based with their cannabis policy. Second bullet, the research that we've done. So as you'll see here today, there's a subset of people who use cannabis and develop addiction to that. So it's about 9%, as if you have a slide, I'll show in a second, of adults. And so for that group of people, one of my goals over the last several years has been to develop treatments that actually work for those folks. So there are no FDA-approved medications for cannabis addiction yet, but that's kind of a thing that we're looking for. And finally is really what we're doing here today, trying to bridge the gap between what the science says and what public perception is. And I've alluded to a little bit of why there's such a gap, because people are distorting evidence, and both sides do it. So it's not just the pro-cannabis people, the anti-cannabis people do it too. We'll talk about it today. There's several key facts that the people who are staunchly opposed to cannabis really don't want to talk about. And I feel that's a mistake, and I'll talk about why that is. So we do a lot of work with schools, colleges, high schools, etc. I work with policymakers all over the country and other countries trying to make better policy, and it's hard to do that. I've had more success, frankly, in other states than Massachusetts, but we can talk about that if you want in the Q&A. So when we talk about cannabis, we're talking about big numbers, okay? So it's been in the news all the time for the last 8 years probably or so, prior to the whole idea of having medical cannabis in Massachusetts. But as we've talked about it so much, the use has gone up, as we'll see in greater detail. So there are millions of Americans, about 22 million Americans or so, and that represents a doubling over the past decade or so. And when you have these votes take place with medical marijuana, so again, right now we have 33 states and the District of Columbia that have medical policies, including Massachusetts, obviously. Legalization, we've got 10 states in D.C. So when you think about that, really the bulk of the country has engaged in these type of debates, so it's very, very important. And finally, as much as we're grateful for you guys to come out on a Sunday, it's looking a little gloomy. I mean, you're making choices, so that's great. But if Justin Bieber says something about cannabis today, he's going to reach a lot more people than I'm going to. So it's important to keep trying to bridge that gap and to try to be evidence-based, and so that's what we're doing. So this slide is very critical really for two reasons. Number one, because it sort of sets the stage talking about the relative addictive potential of cannabis compared to other substances. And then number two, it begins to frame how I think you should be talking about cannabis to your kids or the kids that you coach or whatever role that you might have. But I think talking about it in a sensible way is a seed. So, we talked a little bit about alcohol. I invite the comparison between alcohol and cannabis. The reality is, when you talk about adults, most people who use either one of those substances don't have problems. And obviously we're talking about young people today. When you talk about adults, most people who use cannabis don't develop an addiction. It's about 9%, so 1 in 10 roughly. So we're talking about that subset today. When we talk about treatment, we're talking about that group of people who actually does develop a problem. And what do we mean by that? We mean somebody who is using despite continued problems in key areas of their lives. So that could be work, could be school, could be relationships, and they continue to use. So that's what we're talking about with addiction. With the young people, the fraction is higher. So it's 1 in 6 or so. So the challenge is, so in some ways it may be comforting that if you've got 6 kids and they're all using cannabis, only one of them will develop an addiction. The problem is that I can't tell you which one it's going to be. So if one of those kids is your kid and you're worried about it, it's hard for us to really predict what's going to happen. And that's why intervention is so critical. Getting in there, having the types of conversations that we're going to talk about today, and then if it's warranted, to actually have them see somebody. So, to mention, to be thorough, to talk about cannabis compared to these other substances, that's another thing that the real hardcore anti-cannabis people, they don't want to do. They don't want to ever engage in these types of comparisons. They feel like, and I've been told before, that if you talk about cannabis versus these other substances, then that gives young people the green light to use. I disagree. I strongly disagree, in fact. I feel like if you go into a room, and I've done it so many times, and I've been to schools where this happens, if you go into a room and you take a hardcore stance and you relay the message that if you're a young person and you use cannabis, you're doomed, 5-10 minutes later, you're going to have everybody in their phones, doing this. They're not going to be paying attention. You're going to lose credibility. So that's really what we're talking about here. Scare tactics don't work. Another story that I like to tell. So it's not just trying to scare kids. A couple of years ago, I was asked to speak to a team that was one of the best organizations, in pro sports, and they had just come off of a championship, and they were concerned about synthetic cannabinoids that we'll talk about today, so K2, spice, and that sort of thing. And their head coach came up to me before I was going to go and talk with their players, and he said, "Look, Doc, we really need you to scare these guys away from using this stuff. Let's do that." So it's well-intentioned, but that does not work. These types of scare tactics are really ineffective, and I think that's been demonstrated over time. There have been programs like the DARE program, which have sort of remodeled themselves to try to become a little bit more sensible over time, because they know that kids really doesn't resonate. You got a group of kids who are kind of averse to substances and not impulsive, and it's going to play well with them. And then you've got a group of kids who you're probably not going to reach anyway, who are high risk and they may have co-occurring anxiety or depression, so we're going to talk about those people. But really the middle group is really what the battle is over, trying to influence those folks. I believe you can talk about this in a sensible way. What does that mean? So if you're talking about substances and cannabis is, this is adults, mind you, but the relative proportions are the same. So cannabis is less addictive than alcohol is. It's far less addictive than opioids are. However, important, so people, patients, when you talk to them people have problems, they make choices about what their drug of choice is. So cannabis is less addictive than fentanyl, but somebody may say, look, I really like weed, this is what I want to do, it's my thing, it makes me feel good, and then they can take their use of this less harmful substance to an incredibly unhealthy level. And that's really what I have to deal with a lot, right? You get people who lose multi-million-dollar careers because they can't stop smoking weed. So I do like to invite those types of comparisons, and I think about cannabis, alcohol, and opioids sort of as a continuum in some ways. So you can argue about the types of dangers associated with each of those. And for cannabis and alcohol, pretty similar. It's kind of how you want to define the outcomes. I think certainly you're not going to have a fatal overdose from cannabis, let's say. You may drink yourself to death. I mean, so in some ways, mortality is more likely to occur with alcohol. By far, opioids, though, are the most dangerous of the three. So I do like to talk about that. I think this idea of degrees of danger, generally speaking, cannabis, alcohol, and then opioids. So different degrees of danger. And so again, just because cannabis may not be fentanyl doesn't mean that it's not dangerous. So I think young people can handle that type of subtlety. And some people disagree. And that's kind of why, I think that's why we're in this conundrum. We're in a predicament where we've got a lot of people who mean well, but we really haven't agreed upon how to approach this. I think certainly Scituate does a good job of approaching this in a sensible way. But there are others that are local that really don't. They're still in a very somewhat barbaric way trying to scare kids away from using it. And like I said, there are problems with that. As a result of this type of approach, I think it's a major contributor to this type of data. So there are major surveys, and I know Anne-Marie had sent the YRBS Youth Risk Behavior Survey data from Scituate, and things are looking good in many ways for Scituate, so that's very exciting. But when you think about the overall national overview, I think this data really supports this. So again, one of the major surveys is called Monitoring the Future. It comes out of the University of Michigan. They do it every year. And what they have seen there is this. So again, this is probably going to run counter to what you've heard. But in the face of medical marijuana policies, in the face of legalization, youth use of cannabis is relatively flat. So we've had these policies go into place. Youth use hasn't skyrocketed. If you listen, some people have tried to tell you otherwise in both directions, frankly, but it's relatively flat. However, what is worrisome is this, the right side here, because what you see is a perception of risk. So if we talk about perception of risk for cannabis, you can see here that in the last several years, in the context of these policies, so you have more and more adults using, relatively flat youth use, but in the context of these changes, youth perception of risk is dropping off the charts. So that's where you get scared. Because what does that mean? It means that if we were to plot nicotine and alcohol here, we were to ask kids, let's say we placed you guys with 30 young people. Every one of them knows the dangers of nicotine. And obviously vaping, you guys did hopefully a great session on vaping, because that's a whole other thing. I think that's sort of a misdirection. But kids know that nicotine is bad for you. They know that smoking is bad for you. So I think there was some work to be done with the whole vaping piece. But overall, everybody knows the risks of smoking. So smoking among kids is way down, way down. I mean, probably at all-time lows. As much as we're worried about youth drinking is way down as well. So that is a stark contrast to this. What does that mean? To me, I think one of the key points here to take home is that we do a lousy job of educating kids about cannabis. So, we need to do a better job. And when you think about nicotine, when you think about alcohol, what that shows is that we have the ability to do a better job, right? We've done it. 30 kids, we ask them about smoking, everyone knows the risk. 30 kids, we ask them about drinking, everyone knows the risk. 30 kids, we ask them about cannabis, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to get all different answers. That's the problem here. That's the problem. So with adults, it's a little bit simpler, right? Adults can do what they want to do, and as long as they know the risks, that's fine. Kids, it's different, as we'll talk about with the developing brain, and I think you saw some of that in the first hour, I would imagine. Kids, it's a little bit different. Number one, because you question their ability to make those types of decisions, but the second piece is, what information are they basing those decisions on? That's where we can do a great job, and we haven't done it yet. We should be crystal clear about what the risks are here, and then have the rest of it sort of get figured out, whether or not they're going to make decisions about using it. So, marijuana controversy, why is that? We've alluded to some of this before. People want to make it simple. If you hear people making it simple, beware, because it's not. And that's all that has happened here and everywhere else. I mean, Massachusetts is not alone, but it just, it bugs me, let's put it that way, that you've got really strong advocates on either side, and both of them spin the data. And I could give you examples if you'd like later, but I don't think that's how it goes. And what happens as a result? What happens is you have the pro people and the anti people. They dig in their heels, no compromise takes place, and you end up with policies that stick. So if we were to go downtown Scituate and try to find somebody who's happy with medical marijuana in Massachusetts, I think we'll be out there all day. So no one's happy because the policies are not very good. And the people who are opposed to cannabis, who mean well, right? They don't want young people to use cannabis, but they're not a part of the solution when they just say, no, 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 I don't want this, let's opt out, let's do all these things. And they're not really participating in the policies. Believe it or not, we're in a blue state. And we've had all these policies, and I think that they're weak because people haven't been willing to be a part of it. My take on this from the beginning has always been, we can look at what the science is, but we need to think about what will be happening in the state and then make the best policy that will mitigate the risk. And we really haven't done it, unfortunately. This piece here I think is relevant for you. I think we'll talk about it. Unfortunately, the data that you're working on, if you have used cannabis at all years ago, let's say, the stuff that you use is not the same stuff as today. So what happens is, invariably I'll talk to parents and they'll say, well, we knew that our daughter was using with her friends, but we did that too and we turned out okay. Or they'll say, our son was in his room by himself and we kind of knew what he was doing, but at least he's not using fentanyl. So I understand that, but at the end of the day, we're talking about a very potent cannabis, and the risks are much more than they used to be. So people need to understand that. And finally, math. I don't want to do math if I can avoid it, especially on a Sunday, but you can't really avoid it with cannabis. So again, we've got 22 million Americans. If we've got 9% of adults, we've got 16% of kids. If we're talking 9 or 16% of 22 million, we've got millions of people. So there are millions of people who have cannabis problems. That's why, I'm inundated with all different, young people, athletes. It never ends. And so people don't realize that this is that big a problem until it becomes a real big problem. And that's partially what we're going to talk about in the treatment piece today, trying to do what we can to increase the ability for people to recognize this earlier. So, I give, using the sports example, if somebody, is in the NFL and they failed a couple of drug tests already, and then I get them, they might be somewhere else in the country, but if I get them and they've got one strike left, it's kind of hard to pick that up, right? And so the clinical correlate to that is if somebody's already been expelled from high school or they've already had serious legal problems, it makes it harder. So the sooner that we can get a hold of these people and try to help them, the better. And that's really where I think you can come in. So the myths of cannabis, we'll briefly talk about them and why they're relevant for young people in particular. So the major ones, again, pro-cannabis people will say it's harmless, it's not harmless. People will say that it's not addictive. It absolutely is addictive. However you want to define addiction, we'll talk about that. And then finally, a little less relevant today, this idea of withdrawal. So if you're using cannabis every day, multiple times a day, and you stop abruptly, you're going to have withdrawal symptoms. People aren't expecting that, and that makes it hard to stop. So the special piece today to really focus on the level of risk and why this is so crucial, because when we talk about people who are in middle school and people who are in high school, the level of risk is higher because the brain's still developing. So if you're 25 and below, it sounds like most of us, we're not in that demographic, and so it's over for people who are 25 and above. But if you're 25 and below, your brain's under construction. So just like, I nag my daughters, like, oh, let's have protein, you gotta have milk, because how you're feeding your body when it's developing is so critical. The same thing's true with anything that you might do that could harm your brain or your body, right? How much you're using is critical, as we'll talk about. So what you're using, how much you're using, just a higher level of risk. Certainly if somebody's 35 and they are smoking 4 times a day and they're not going to work, you know, that's a serious issue. But there's just a different level of risk involved with young people. So that's why we got to figure it out. Why is the brain, and I know, I'm imagining Dr. Harris talked about a lot of this type of thing in the first talk, but when you think about cannabis, there are 2 major types of cannabis receptors, cannabinoid receptors. One of them is primarily located in the brain, and it's all over the brain. So cannabis affects the brain. I mean, we really covered, again, we covered every part of the brain here. You know, appetite, obviously, you've got increased appetite. Amygdala is fight or flight, so that affects your ability to react, to get yourself to safety. The cortex is high-level decision-making. Hippocampus is memory. Cerebellum is balance. You know, that gets to the whole driving issue. So if you're using cannabis, it's going to have a serious impact, both today and down the road. So acute use has its own levels of risk, more relevant to like driving and things like that. But the major harms that we're going to talk about in a second mostly have to do with chronic use. So let's talk about the chronic harms associated with cannabis. And so this here, the heading here really, again, sort of distinguishes how I do this and how some other people do this. So I think it's fair to say that if you listen to some other people who do kind of work that I do, they're going to tell you about all these risks, right? They're going to make it seem like, again, like this is the worst thing you could ever do. All these bad things can happen. And all these things can happen, but the dose really makes a huge difference. So that's, again, one of the half-truths here. So people can do the research, they can point to the harms of cannabis, but they don't talk about the fact that how much you use over what period of time makes a huge difference. I mean, almost all the difference. So, you know, the people that we treat, the patients who have a problem, they have an addiction, they're using pretty much every day, usually multiple times a day. And so these problems here, that's for those people who are using in that way. That's the 9% of adults, it's the 16%. These are people who are using it heavily. What about everybody else? What about those people who are using it once a month, once a week, that type of thing? We know a lot less about it. And that's one thing that people don't want to talk about, right? Because if we just draw that distinction between regular heavy use and sporadic use, then maybe that's going to water down the message, and then kids will say, well, I'm not a heavy user, and I don't have to worry about it. No, I don't want that, but we do need to be clear that the best data is for people who are using a lot, who have crossed that threshold into an addiction. So early and regular use affects your ability to think at high levels. You know, the imaging studies that have been done more or less, and again, I'm not a neuroanatomist, but when you look at the data, what you see is a healthy control versus a young person who's using cannabis daily. A person who's using cannabis daily will be recruiting different parts of their brain to get the same amount of work done. You know, so if we go back here, you know, in the cortex, let's say, the healthy control, you have a very focused area where if you're doing some tests, right, this will light up when they're doing these imaging studies. And the person using cannabis is like the whole brain is lighting up. You know, so to me, you know, to try to simplify that in some way, it's very complex, but to try to simplify it, you're revving your engine at high RPMs, right? This will get you to the school today, but it's really not the best strategy for the long-term life of your engine. And as a result, I think the next step to that is really the type of study here that you know, shows that over time that the heavy use, early and regular use of cannabis, generally, again, 25 and below is high risk, but the studies here we're really looking at starting at 16, 15 years old. If you're doing that, then you can lose up to 8 points of your IQ over time. And that's more than a standard deviation, so that's very, very significant. Other things that are relevant in what patients will talk about, so anxiety, so it worsens anxiety. Patients will come to me and they'll say, look, I use it to treat my anxiety. And so that entails a certain conversation where we talk about, okay, if you're anxious, you smoke, your anxiety goes down. When cannabis wears off, your anxiety goes back up. You have this type of thing happen. Over time, your baseline level of anxiety increases when you're using cannabis. So, and again, just to be thorough, there are parts of the cannabis plant, when you isolate them, that may ultimately be shown to be effective to treat anxiety. But when you're using whole plant cannabis, potent cannabis, stuff that you get in the dispensaries, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about worsening anxiety, worsening depression. If you're spending all of your time smoking and you're not doing your homework, you still got to do it at some point, and you're going to probably feel bad when you still have the homework to do or you get lousy grades. And then this piece here is chilling, this idea that if you have a family history of a psychotic disorder, so that's schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, if you have a family history of that, you're more likely to express it if you're using cannabis. So again, you're not causing it, you're not creating schizophrenia, but you're more likely to express it. Depends on what study you look at, but really you're up to 5 times more likely. So that's high risk. So if you have those things in your family or you know somebody that does, they're even more high risk than other people would be. So again, risk factors, a family history of addiction certainly is a huge risk factor, but a family history of really other psychiatric conditions, especially psychotic disorders. And what does that look like? So again, unfortunately, I've had to treat a lot of these patients where you'll see a 15-year-old kid, never seen a psychiatrist before, they start using cannabis 4 or 5 months, and then boom, now they've got hallucinations, they're in the hospital, they're getting these really nasty medications, and families are wondering, is my son ever going to get back to normal? And the answer is probably no, unfortunately. So I still have some of these patients over time, and it's the kind of thing where it depends what success is, how you want to define it. But I think of a patient that I saw last week, and I was in Pennsylvania yesterday, but this kid is from a top university in Pennsylvania, and now he's got a job, but it's not the kind of job that his classmates have. And so, you struggle with that. Parents know that he's not achieving. He knows that he's not, like his friends are working for an investment, they're doing investment banking and all kinds of stuff, and he's got a, kind of a retail job, so which I think is a success in some ways from where he's been in the last few years, but that's really a sad thing to have to come to grips with. So this is, it's not a small matter. This paper, I just threw this in just because it's recent, it's kind of cool. It comes from Randy Schuster, who's at Mass General. It's published not too, a few weeks ago, and somebody was asking me about it, but I think it's good. Just really quickly, so we talk about people who are using, we talk about the 8-point IQ decline and everything, but this paper here that came out a few weeks ago shows that if you're using cannabis regularly and you stop, so this group was able to maintain abstinence, and this is memory, a test of memory, they actually quickly recovered. So you're not going to gain everything back, but you can gain something back. So it really shows, this paper shows 2 things. Number one, your brain doesn't work as well as it would without cannabis, and I think we all know that. But number 2, it's never too late to intervene. If you intervene, you can get some of it back. How much, we don't know, but you get some of it back. So it's never, never be hopeless about it. And again, the sooner that we can get in there and try to get somebody to stop using, the better off we're going to be. Addiction, however you want to define addiction, I like, as I alluded to before, I like repeated use despite harm. It's a pretty simple definition, but it meets really what we're talking about. And I just like this slide. I've been showing it for a long time, just because, and I also said earlier, I like comparing alcohol and cannabis. What I don't like is talk about hard drugs and soft drugs, because I told you guys before, patients make choices, right? They decide what they like. And so in this slide, I think, is a great example. So you got your brain. When you're stimulating the brain, you have release of multiple chemicals, including dopamine, which you probably have heard of before. So this slide just shows that if you're using stimulants like Adderall, cocaine, you have a release of dopamine in the brain when you use it. Cannabis, it's the same thing. I always say cheesecake here. But my point is this: while the scales are different here, so that's important just to be, again, transparent. but the process is the same. You do something that you enjoy, tastes good, makes you feel good, you have this type of dopaminergic surge. And so I think the take-home point there is that, you know, people are going to take a substance that is not fentanyl, let's say, but they may really like it, and that's their thing. So hard drug, soft drug, I think people would say that cocaine, amphetamines, that's a hard drug. Most people would say marijuana is a soft drug. I say it really does the same type of thing. So I don't like that kind of split. And then withdrawal, like I said, we'll just keep this one simple. If you're using regularly and you stop, you're going to feel bad. And that's part of the treatment process, is helping people deal with that withdrawal. This slide just shows quickly that cannabis withdrawal is similar to tobacco withdrawal. Anxiety, irritability, difficulty sleeping. The degrees are different, you know, so you got some differences in the degrees, but it feels the same in many ways. So we're more familiar with how hard it is to stop smoking cigarettes, but stop using cannabis is also difficult if you're using to a very significant level. Talked about this earlier. Again, people may have used in yesteryear. We'll talk about the potency in just a second. But what's in the plant? You got hundreds of chemicals, over 120 cannabinoids. So those are chemicals specific to the cannabis plant. And yet we only talk about 2. So it kind of gets to this idea that we're always trying to make this much more simple than it is. It's really not simple. So delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, you've heard of before, makes you high on one side, so that's the good part. Makes you psychotic, that's the bad part, so it's quite extreme. Cannabidiol, CBD, that's the hot one people have been talking about a lot. We did, I was on Point on NPR maybe a month ago, talking about this. So people are very excited about it. I'm excited about it too. You might be able to do a lot of great things with it. It's not going to make you high, so it's not intoxicating. It does affect your ability to think in various ways. It probably has anti-anxiety properties, I alluded to that earlier, and antipsychotic properties. So why do you hear about these two together all the time? Because they're actually competing for certain precursors at the plant level. That's why over the last several years, the whole farming piece and genetic engineering, we've increased the THC contents and CBD has gone down. It's kind of like growing tomatoes, right? Everybody can do it now. You've got the soil, you've got the lights, so everybody's growing cannabis, and it's far stronger, segue, far stronger than it used to be. So in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, average THC content was 3 to 4%. Now the average THC content, so a friend of mine, Mahmoud El-Soli, he runs the NIDA cannabis farm in Mississippi. So he's the only one in the country who's allowed to grow it for studies. And he published a paper in 2016 where the average THC content was 12. However, I actually saw him a little less than a month ago, and his next paper is going to say it's about 19%. So 19% is the average, but if you go to the Massachusetts dispensaries, etc., you can get the plant flower in the 20s or 30s. So my point is this, don't be misguided by whatever experience you may have had. I mean, this is a whole different ballgame. So the bad things that can happen, psychosis, vomiting sometimes people have, those things are more likely to occur when you're using the stronger stuff. And then this, just a quick tour, because these are their own topics under their own. I actually talked about vaping a couple of days ago and somewhere else. But I mentioned this earlier, synthetic cannabinoids. So when we talk about synthetic cannabinoids, I'm talking about illegal cannabinoids that you can get online or get them at some gas stations. Some people talk about synthetics and they're talking about the FDA-approved, there are 3 FDA-approved cannabinoids now. I'm talking about K2 spice spike. Very quickly, the people who use this stuff, people are going to be drug tested, so that's people on probation, people in the military, athletes, etc. And more dangerous than regular cannabis, because what you have, I mentioned that you saw the slide with the THC and the CBD, you have THC-like compounds without the CBD. So CBD kind of buffers the problematic stuff with THC. You don't have that with synthetics. So they're nasty things, and they make people do really crazy things, unfortunately. Concentrates, so wax, shatter, dabbing, when you hear people talk about it, that's what we're talking about. You're distilling the plant into a very pure form, 80–90% THC, and now that you guys have been paying attention, that's probably going to be a problem, right? If you're going to have psychosis with a 20% flower, then what could happen if you're using 80–90% THC? And then again, I know that you have the opportunity to talk about vaping and stuff. So e-cigarettes, when you're talking about the older versions of e-cigarettes, you can buy liquid THC cartridges. You can put your own plant matter in there. But I'm sure the vaping is really mostly talking these days about the Juul, and so you just have nicotine pods for those. But that's a whole other major issue, certainly. Edibles, to me, is just we talked earlier about how we do a poor job of educating. I don't think there's a better example of that than the edibles. So again, you continue to have people go into the ER because they've taken edibles and they're not expecting the dose, right? So when you think about that, a typical brownie has 100 milligrams of THC. The typical serving size is 10 milligrams. So, I don't know about you, but when I'm having a brownie, I eat the whole thing. So most people do that. They'll eat the whole brownie. They'll try to, or they'll take a bite. Nothing happens. Take another bite. Nothing happens. 30 minutes later, they've got probably 4 or 5 times the dose. So 40–50 milligrams of THC in somebody who's not experienced, you're going to end up in the ER. You're not going to die, but it's very, very unpleasant. And that should never happen. Should never happen. Nor should it ever be packaged like this. And I think that's another great lament of mine. As a matter of fact, I saw a picture in the Globe or somewhere. So you got some legal recreational stores opening up, and I saw a picture of one of the stores, and they're gummy products. I mean, I just don't understand how much time do we have to spend on these types of things to impress upon people. There's no reason to have it look like that. So the argument is, well, you're going to put it in opaque packaging, etc. But at the end of the day, if you open it up and you put it on the ground or you put it on a table, it looks like candy. There's just, like I said, some things about it are so frustrating that people hear these messages over and over again, and yet you haven't made the changes, and that's it's very frustrating. So let's shift gears, talk about treatment. We've got some time, and we'll take some questions. So we'll move through this relatively quickly. So just typical case. I mean, I get these every day pretty much. So Mike, 16-year-old kid in high school, comes to me, got suspended. So with cannabis, like we said, we're trying to move up the ability to intervene here. So ideally, it's greater to intervene before this happens, but cannabis is tough. It's tough to get a nose for what's going on. So this one kid got suspended. He's getting treatment for other things, so that's a major take-home point. If you've got a problem with cannabis or any other substance, really, it's probably not going to occur in a vacuum. There's other things going on. They may be diagnosable or they may not be. So it might be ADHD, anxiety, depression, whatever, or it could be a really serious psychosocial problem, right? Your daughter is not in the right group and she's not really getting treated well by other more influential kids in her class, that type of thing. So that could be its own problem that requires intervention. But the point is, if it rises to the level of coming in to see me or somebody like me, something needs to be done, I think. It's very rare. I mean, it does happen, but it's very rare that I'll say, there's nothing necessary to do here. I mean, at minimum, we're monitoring things. So this young person said, it makes me chill. And that's not a verb, that's actually an adjective that he said. So it's a patient I still have. So what do you look for? So it could be social problems caused by or worsened by cannabis, in this case, giving up important activities. As I like to say for this bullet here, kid could play town soccer for 10 years, and now they're a sophomore, and they're not playing. Doesn't mean they got a problem with weed, but it might. So you got to know what the baseline is in order to know when somebody is deviated from the norm. Use in dangerous situations, kids in cars with cannabis, usually. And then this one here is kind of what this last case was. So that's somebody who has a diagnosis, they're on their 3rd stimulant, and now we realize that they're smoking 4 times a day, or they're on Celexa and it's not working. So things that have been sort of half treated, and then they come to me. Right? I get a lot of that. How to have that conversation with them. What are you going to do I conceptualize it as 4 steps. I'm not trying to zip through that. I don't want to do that. So preparation, conversation, evaluation, referral. Preparation, build it before you need it, right? So that's the ability to have these type of difficult conversations. I got one of my patients that I've been following for years. He's doing well, thankfully. But I remember in the early going, he said to me, look, my dad talks to me about 2 things, the Red Sox and the weather. And you know, that's not what we're talking about here. So you got to ask these types of questions. And I think, again, that's probably the biggest thing that this type of talk does. You know, I think it's not necessarily you guys learning the specifics, but it's just having the idea that there are people that can help you, that want to help you. And similarly, if you're asking questions about these types of things in a sensible way, then I think your kids are going to approach you. If they know that you are, you know, strongly anti this, and you take a hardcore stance and use the scare tactics, then they may or may not do it. But if they do it, they're definitely not going to tell you about it because they know that you're going to be angry about it. So you gotta think about these types of ramifications. What are you going to do if they say yes? What are you going to do if they say no? Unfortunately, people often try to get somebody to do something, and when you meet that resistance, they just sort of, I don't know what to do now. So you got to think these things through. The conversation is simple. I'm concerned. I think you need an evaluation. So you're not making a diagnosis. You're just trying to get them help. So evaluation, as I said, again, I think you're in a great position here because you've got a group like Scituate Facts that helps you. You know, they're trying to help you. You've got people who want to put you in touch with people who know what to do. I don't think you have to absolutely see somebody with certain credentials, but they got to be good. Because if you're going to try to do this, the window of opportunity is probably not going to be open very long. So there are good people who are social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, but if you get a chance, like you gotta, you might not get many chances. What does the evaluation look like? Just very briefly for me, this piece here is really designed, motivational interviewing. How I think about that is that nobody is interested, kids are not interested in IQ loss. They're not interested in it's going to affect their ability to drive. It's not going to, they're not that interested in even their ability to hit a baseball. I think the big picture stuff is not really what they're interested in. What they're interested in is something that may be important to them. I want to go to Dartmouth. I want to play in the sectionals in 2 weeks. I want to keep driving the car. And so if somebody comes into me and they're a young person, I've got to figure out what that thing is. And if I do it, then I feel like I have a chance. And they may not want to do what I think they should do right away. Most times they don't. But if I've made a connection with them, I've listened to them, which I think is a little easy. It's easier for me in some ways just because, again, when you think about technology, everybody's in their phones. I'm going to sit with somebody, I'm going to listen to them. And if you do that, it helps you build that alliance. Making a referral. Most treatment for cannabis is outpatient. Let's move on. What does it look like? You're not going to do a detox. You're not going to go to Malibu for 6 weeks. You're going to do outpatient treatment. You could be in a program if things are really bad, so that could be an intensive outpatient program, a partial program. But the biggest thing is just getting the prospective patient to talk to somebody so you figure out what's going on. What do we need to do? Is there a cannabis addiction? Is there depression going on? What's going on that we need to do something about? And like I said, if you build that alliance in the early going, when somebody's ready, then they'll call you back. So this young person, Mike, started weekly talk therapy to establish a limited period of abstinence. So if a kid comes to me, they're using every day for 2 years, I'm not going to say, hey, look, we got to stop doing this for the rest of your life. It's overwhelming and it just is a waste of time. But what I'll say is, look, you're worried about your mood or you're worried about whatever it is, let's see if we can get you to not use cannabis for a month. And then we'll see how your mood is, or we'll see how your attention is. And that's what we try to do. So talk therapy helped figure out why he was doing this. There's grief involved when your friends are doing this and you're not, and you're giving it up. This young man has done well. I have a lot of patients who do well. It's just a question of getting to them early and trying to make an alliance. So we'll go to some questions in just a second. Tons of misinformation about cannabis, like I said. Both sides do it. They do it all day long. We've been doing it for years here in Massachusetts, and unfortunately, I don't see it ending anytime soon. So it's important to really have yourself to be knowledgeable about what the facts are And so that you can talk about it in a sensible way. You're not regurgitating something that is not really right because so-and-so is trying to get you to vote against it, or someone's trying to get you to opt out or whatever. Just be careful on who you listen to. And then finally, this thing here I think is critical, not just with marijuana. You talk about opioids and alcohol at the top. If somebody needs treatment and they get the right treatment and they're ready to get treatment, it can work. So somebody can be using 2 grams of fentanyl a day, have multiple opioid overdoses. If they get into treatment and they really want to make it work, it can work. Similarly, if you get a kid using half an ounce a week of cannabis, they've gotten expelled. That can also work. So it's really hard to tell who's going to do well. So there's a role for you, there's a role for the patient, obviously, and a role for treatment. But I've seen it happen over and over again, and I think that's what keeps people like me going, is that we have patients who do well. And I've got patients who have done well for 10 years now. I've been doing this for a while, and I still see them periodically, and I see them in the community. So that's very rewarding. So I know that as much as we're worried about how these things take place and the people who aren't doing well, I know they can do well, and that really keeps us going. So people to thank. Matt Blastro is one of my research assistants, and then we'll move to questions. So we got 10 minutes at least. Who's up? Yep.
So can you briefly talk about the person who's in chronic pain and gets the whatever the card is called, and then starts using or buying? Is it effective, or?
So talking about using cannabis to treat chronic pain, it can be effective. So I think when you look at the evidence for medical cannabis, I think the best evidence is for 3 things. Chronic pain, neuropathic pain, which is a variation of pain, and then M.S, multiple sclerosis spasticity. However, let's say you've got chronic pain, somebody has chronic pain. I'm not saying that cannabis is a first-line treatment. I'm saying that you should work with your doctor and try first-line treatments, second-line treatments. And I get patients who come to me and they've done, I had a patient, a woman who had tried 14 things. In that case, I think everything is fair game. So I think there is a role for it. Many patients have said, I've been prescribed opioids for pain, and I'm using medical cannabis now to use fewer opioids, and the data actually supports that. So I think there can be a role there. Unfortunately, I mentioned dissatisfaction with medical cannabis. The reality is that the way in which it's practiced is not great. So people get a medical card from a doctor they may never see again, not interested in following up. So those things are a problem, but there is a role. So, yeah.
Mine is along similar lines. I actually founded the Cohasset coalition, and so I'm being very transparent here. I have chronic nerve pain.
Yeah.
I've tried, you want to say 14, I've probably tried 24 different things, including surgeries, etc. And I am trying to figure, I tried CBDs and CBD oils and CBD ointments. I haven't tried the things with THC. I got an appointment with a doctor. I said, should I bring all my medical records? Oh, that's not necessary. That's not necessary. Just come on in. I said, so
what if I told you that, though?
Seems like a scam. I said, it seems like a scam. I get paid $275 for me to come in and you to write out a card.
Yeah.
So anyway, I didn't know if the stuff with the THC would work better than the CBD, because that's not doing anything.
So
what's your experience?
The answer is yes. So for treating chronic pain, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is more likely to treat pain than cannabidiol is. But you're talking about the issues, right? What if I saw 20
I would think you were a quack, I wouldn't go to you.
Well, yeah, so, because I was going to say, if I saw 20 patients tomorrow and I gave every one of them Prozac 20 milligrams, what would you say? Not very good,
yeah.
Right? And all they're doing is cranking out these certifications.
Yeah.
And I think it's unfortunate. There were some other issues associated with it, but I think at the end of the day, what I would recommend is, I would hope that you're able to talk about it with your doctor, and you can still get that card if that's the way that you're going to access.
My doctor's recommended it now at this point.
So that's good.
We've tried everything.
So that's good.
Yeah.
So as long as that's that's being supervised so that your doctor is aware that you're using cannabis in addition to whatever other medicines you're on. That's a better place to be than not feeling like you can tell your doctor and relying on this other doctor. So it sounds like a reasonable step. Yep.
What recommendations do you have in terms of educating specifically young people? Because you said there's sort of a void there about cannabis.
I want them to know what the evidence is, but I want to talk about it in a sensible way. I think fentanyl is out there, opioids are out there. I think you should be talking about cannabis and fentanyl, these type of things. And for the most part, like I said, certain people who kind of do this sort of thing, they don't want to compare cannabis to anything else. And so I think if you go in, you talk about it in a sensible way, you do two things. You build credibility, you're able to teach in a credible way, but more importantly, you say that whoever is leading this, the health teacher, the school, they're interested in doing this in an evidence-based way. So that way, in 3 weeks, if the student has a question or they're worried about somebody else or themselves, then they can go to somewhere. Whereas if you come in and you've got people, using the scare tactics and the doomsday type approaches, they're not going to talk about it. They feel ashamed that they're doing it, or you know what I mean. So I think a sensible approach. There are people doing it. But I think it actually was talking yesterday with the people from SAMHSA. So it sounds like they're moving too. I think there's frustration. Like I said, we showed the data. Perception of risk is dropping, and so there's a lot of variability in how this education is taking place, and I think they want to offer better things.
Have you seen any districts that are doing a particularly good job?
Well, again, I think you guys are in a good place here. So yeah, I think there are several pockets in Massachusetts that do a good job. There's some other states that I've been to that are doing a good job. It's hard though, and there are other places that aren't doing a good job, and those are places where they don't want to take time away from preparing for M.H.S, that type of thing, and so there's a wide variability. I think everybody should have access to the evidence-based treatments, and so again, it's great to be in a place, preaching to the choir. You're in a place with a lot of resources and people are interested, and that's great, but that's not the norm. It's a huge state with a ton of communities, so think about it that way. What percentage of the communities, what are there, 200? There's like
271.
271. So what percentage of the 271 are doing this in a good way? I'd probably leave that to the human rate. Yeah, so that's frustrating. Anybody else? We got just a couple more minutes, and I think we got another session.
So I'm just curious, people that come see you, they come see you when they're ready? Or they
No,
just to see you?
they
You
don't.
have both,
So
okay.
when we're talking about cannabis is special because I've never had a person call me up on the phone and say, "Hey doc, I know I could lose 8 points on my IQ. Help me stop." That's never happened. Young people are getting pushed in by their parents, which I think is still great. If they make it into my office, then some part of that young person knows that they got to do something. And so that's the door's open for me. I get a chance to do what I do, and good things will happen. I'll be able to make an alliance, that type of thing. Ultimately, we talk about what kind of treatment has to take place, whether it be treat a co-occurring disorder, it could be doing some talk therapy. There could be resistance there. Like, do I really need to do something every week? Do I really need to? And you deal with that. But I think once you have somebody in the office and you establish that type of rapport, invariably they're going to call you when they're ready. And the question is, are they going to do that before they lose everything? It's not just young people, anybody. Are they going to lose their collegiate career? Are they going to lose their job or their relationship? And my hope is that they decide to do it before they lose everything. And so that's really the question. When are they going to be ready? Anybody else? I think we're take one more question and then we got 3 o'clock. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any pending legislation or proposed policies like around gummies that concerned parents should try to advocate for
Nope.
or support?
No. So that's when you think about medical cannabis, I mean, we talk about this all day. When you think about it, in our own state, which I think should be a leader in these areas. And we've had medical marijuana since 2012. And you know, you could make a case that there have been 0 substantive changes to the policy in all that time. And you know, that's one of them. I mean, that's just like, it's ridiculous to me. I mean, yeah, there really haven't been. Other states have done better jobs at this than we have, frankly. And so I'm not aware, I mean, I think for the most part, medical is on the back burner. You know, the CCC, Cannabis Control Commission, they're supposed to be running it now. They haven't been. So, it's unfortunate. But I'll let you get going. I think they got a 3 o'clock session. Thanks, everybody.